Hey, welcome. So in this clip, we're going to be getting started on Descartes, one of the key figures in early modern philosophy. As we go through and look at other figures in early modern philosophy, in many ways we can think of them as responding to Descartes. So in certain ways, you can't get away from Descartes as you work your way through early modern philosophy. So what I want to do in this video is talk about some starting points, some basic ideas about what's going on in the Meditations, this important text by Descartes. And then we're also going to look at some of the key moves, some of the key ideas and lines of thought that emerge in the first meditation. One thing we'll notice is we can talk about Descartes' Meditations as being in 6 parts. So the idea is we are sort of walking along with Descartes in this text, where he goes from, in a certain way, knowing nothing at all the way up to, knowing the most important things, getting them back. So we go from nothing to everything. Each meditation happens in one day, so we go from knowing nothing to everything in 6 days. Maybe almost kind of like the Book of Genesis or something. Now, it is important to notice that Descartes did not actually write the Meditations in 6 days. You can think of the person speaking to you in this text as almost like a literary device. It's sort of like one of Plato's dialogues, except it's a one-person dialogue. It's a monologue, or it's a dialogue with oneself, trying to work out an important philosophical issue. But as it's written, the meditator is going through a series of thoughts. One other thing that we should think about when we think about the Meditations is that the order in which certain claims are made is really important. So something that might be claimed in Meditation 1 is something that would make sense there, but not in Meditation 6. Or some of the things that are being said in Meditation 6 wouldn't really make sense or be logically admissible straight away at the end of Meditation 1. Right? So the Meditations are a step-by-step process. And just a hint, they're going to give us this process of going from knowing nothing back to everything, or at least everything that's important for Descartes. Let me just say a few things about Descartes' biography. He was born right at the end of the 16th century, lived into the middle of the 17th century, was a French philosopher, was a strong mathematician. The most famous thing that Descartes is known for is advances in algebraic geometry. So if you ever see a geometric equation or an algebraic equation that is written out on coordinates with an x-axis and a y-axis, they call these Cartesian coordinates. And things that are Cartesian are things derived from Descartes. So Cartesian coordinate geometry, he invented that. Interestingly, Descartes studied at a Jesuit college in France. This is important because these Jesuit colleges were staffed with scholastics, that is, the followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, that we learned about just recently. Another interesting piece of historical trivia is another 100 or so years later, one David Hume would spend time working on his philosophical writings in the vicinity of this same college, La Flèche. So Descartes is known for a number of significant works. Discourse on the Method, quite similar in some ways to Meditations on First Philosophy, but also in Discourse on the Method, Descartes gives a famous, perhaps infamous, argument where he claims that animals don't have minds in the way that people do. Claims, in fact, that an animal is kind of like a fancy stimulus response robot. Right? Later on in his career, and dealing with some of the questions related to the mind-body problem that we're eventually going to learn about, he wrote a book called The Passions of the Soul. He was trying to figure out how to connect mental things with physical things, and he tried to work that out in a theory of the passions. You might realize that emotions are somewhat in your head and somewhat in your body. Descartes was onto this insight and tried to develop it in order to solve the mind-body problem later in his career. But we're looking at Meditations, one of clearly Descartes' most famous work and one of the famous works in the history of philosophy. I want you to notice the full title. So it's called Meditations on First Philosophy, and then as books often do, they have a subtitle. And Descartes says, in which the existence of God and the distinction of the human soul from the body are demonstrated. Now, a couple of things to notice here. One is he's basically giving away what's going to be established philosophically in this work, right? So he's telling us that if he succeeds in his project, he's going to be able to show you that God exists and that your mind is distinct from your soul, right? The other important word to notice here is this word demonstrated, right? Now, when we talk about demonstration, in common parlance, you might think of the word demonstration as meaning something like showing something. Like if you go onto YouTube and look for a product demo, it might be for a guitar pedal or something, they're going to show you what the guitar pedal sounds like. So it's like show and tell. It's not what the word demonstration means in the context of early modern philosophy. So you should be watching for this word as the semester goes on. And when they talk about a demonstration, they are talking about a proof. And it's a proof of the most certain kind. Right? So for instance, when we're talking about demonstrations, we're saying it's a proof, and it's a proof that once you see it, you know that what it's establishing has to be true. Right? So for instance, I could give you a demonstration that there is no greatest prime number. Right? Or in other words, that there's an infinite number of prime numbers. What you do, if you want to know, is you take all the prime numbers that you have so far and multiply them together, and then add 1. So for instance, if I multiply 2 times 3, that's like, 1 times 2 times 3 is all the prime numbers so far. And then I add 1, well, that gets me 1 times 2 times 3 is 6, add 1, that's 7. That's actually a new prime number, right? And if I do that again and again and again, I will always get prime numbers by multiplying all the primes and adding 1. And it kind of makes sense, right? Because you've factored all the primes into a single equation, and then you add 1, so it won't be perfectly divisible by all those factors, right? So if you followed along with that line of reasoning, you've actually seen that that's a demonstration, that is, a most certain proof that the number of prime numbers is infinite, right? And Descartes is going to say, look, when we're talking about demonstration, we're talking about the most certain kind of science, or the most certain kind of knowledge. And he's going to say that, geometry is a model of that kind of demonstrative knowledge, right? So he's not just going to give you a good bit of probable evidence that God exists and your mind and body are distinct, but he's going to try to give you a proof, right? The highest standard of certainty. Now, sometimes when you hear about Descartes, you hear about this concept of Cartesian skepticism, right? This is the kind of skepticism that says, oh, well, we don't really know whether or not we're in the matrix, right? Now, what I want to flag here is just that there are a lot of different kinds of things that are called skepticism. Now, the word skepticism, roughly put, is just the view that you don't know anything, right? So if I am a skeptic about morality, then I'm saying you don't know anything about morality. If I'm a skeptic about religion, then I would say, well, there's no religious knowledge, right? There are other ways of approaching skepticism, and I'll just flag a few different kinds so that we can situate where Descartes lives within this realm. So the first kind of skeptic, and these were skeptics who came out of Plato's school, right? The academy. So this is actually why it's called academic skepticism. This is the view that nobody knows anything. Now, here's the problematic, puzzling thing about academic skepticism. It's that if you get really good at academic skepticism, your theory self-defeats itself, right? Because if somebody comes up to you and says, nobody knows anything, you can ask them, well, is that like just your opinion, or do you really know it, right? And if they say that they know academic skepticism is true, well, then their theory self-refutes, right? And if they say, well, who knows, or we're not certain, then you would have to say back to them, well, then maybe somebody knows something and maybe nobody knows anything. But you can't make an assertion either way as an academic skepticism, or at least you're going to shoot yourself in the foot if you prove your theory true. Now, because this theory is self-refuting, it's not the only version of skepticism, right? There's also Pyrrhonian skepticism. Now, if you tell a Pyrrhonian skeptic that you know something, they say, maybe you do. But then they might also say, but maybe you don't, right? So the Pyrrhonian skeptic, if you tell them that it's going to rain today, they say it might rain, but it might not. Now, the tricky thing is that the Pyrrhonian is not actually making an assertion, right? They're not denying your claim, they're just raising another possibility. And in a certain way, the Pyrrhonian skeptic is saying, look, because very many things might be true, just don't believe anything, right? Say it might rain or it might not rain. Who knows, right? Interestingly, followers of Pyrrhonian skepticism, figures like Sextus Empiricus in the ancient world, they were not aiming to know things or come up with the correct theory of the world. What they were aiming at was something more like mental peace, this state of mind called ataraxia, that is, to not be troubled with the burdens of believing certain things. Now, these are forms of skepticism, but they're not Descartes' form of skepticism. Now, here is Descartes' form of skepticism. It's sometimes called methodological skepticism. And here's what the methodological skeptic says. It's kind of like the Pyrrhonian skeptic, and it says, well, maybe one thing is true, maybe another thing is true, but what they're actually saying is, if you can't be absolutely certain of something, then don't believe it, right? So don't make an assertion unless you're absolutely sure. And you should also be inviting as many possible doubts as you can, right? But this strategy for methodological skeptics like Descartes is to withhold your belief about anything until it's impossible to doubt that particular proposition. So until that belief is, and this is Descartes' terminology that you'll see all throughout the Meditations, you can only believe something, you should only believe something, if you're believing it indubitably. That is, unless it's something that's absolutely impossible to doubt. Right? Now, why are we looking for beliefs that are absolutely impossible to doubt? Well, this traces back to another approach that we see in Descartes, and it's an approach called foundationalism. Right? So it's typically contrasted with coherentism. And the foundationalist, we get sort of a building analogy from them. I'm just pulling into my text here. If you're dealing with the Shapiro and Lascano book, if we go to 97, right? So this is the first paragraph of the Meditations, right? First paragraph of the first meditation on page 97. Descartes said, "It's now several years since I noticed how from the time of my early youth I had accepted many false claims as true, how everything I had later constructed on top of those falsehoods was doubtful, and thus how, at some point in my life, I needed to tear everything down completely and begin again from the most basic foundations, if I wished to establish something firm and lasting in the sciences." So, what's the point here? Descartes is saying, look, when we form beliefs, oftentimes we form a belief by building it on something else we believe. But a lot of the things that we believe and that we build other beliefs on, we're not 100% certain that that thing you believe is true. Excuse me. Now, Descartes is saying, look, if we have uncertainty at our starting point, then what we build up from, and he uses that word, foundation, well, it can't be any more certain than a shaky foundation. Right? So oftentimes the idea is, look, with foundationalism, if you have belief B, this arrow is going to say this belief gets justified by belief A. And what about belief A? Well, it's supposed to be so certain, so self-evident, so obvious, so impossible for that belief to be false, that we don't have to do any further looking. That there's a stopping point in our inquiry. But moreover, if we're going to build belief B on belief A, if it's resting on it, like this arrow is indicating, belief A had better be rock solid. Right? So this is an epistemological approach that's sometimes contrasted with a view that's called coherentism. It's basically saying, look, you've got belief A, right? Well, how do you know that belief is true? Well, we're going to refer to belief B there. Well, how do you know that belief B is true? Well, belief C. How do you know that belief C is true? Well, actually, belief A offers some justification for it. Now, with just 3 beliefs, it almost looks like a circular argument. But of course, if you get a whole bunch of beliefs, maybe 16 or 20 or 100 beliefs that are all sort of meshed together, the coherentist thinks that you can add some justification to each of these beliefs by thinking about how each belief fits into the web. Right? But Descartes is not having this, right? So Descartes thinks, because of this uncertainty, because of this risk of making errors, you should withhold your assent to every belief and start over by building up from what we might think of as like a rock-solid foundation, if we want to continue that building metaphor. So, for Descartes, all good and justified beliefs are going to have this quality of being indubitable. That is, it's a belief that in and of itself it cannot be doubted. Or it might be a further belief that you logically derive from the indubitable belief. And if you can't see that something is indubitable or the logical consequence of something indubitable, then you should withhold judgment. Right? To the best you can, you should stop believing that thing. And part of why this is important, and this comes out in that couple of sentences that I read, you've got to do this, Descartes says, if you want to establish something firm and lasting in the sciences. Right? So part of why we might see Descartes engaging in this foundational approach is because we cannot have error in our starting points for science, right? Because that's going to be like our starting point for mapping out and navigating the world. Here's another claim that he makes. So this is one page over. He claims, "It is prudent never to place one's entire trust in things which have deceived us even once." Right? So he's saying, look, there are lots of things that we might put our trust in forming our beliefs, but you can't trust things completely if they've gotten things wrong, even just one time. Right? So, take an example. Maybe you have a favorite newspaper, and you read some shocking new news in this morning's edition. Well, you might say, that's a really good reason to believe it. But if somebody says, would you bet everything? Would you bet your house, your life, on this claim simply because it's in the newspaper? Now, you might be pretty sure of it. But you might also realize that sometimes this newspaper has printed errors, right? Sometimes there are typos, sometimes there are reporting mistakes, sometimes there's unreliable sources. And we might say, look, from a rational point of view, if you acknowledge that every newspaper publishes an error sometimes, you shouldn't put your entire trust in it. Now, we might also say that this is too aggressive a principle. Like, would you stop believing everything that your friends say simply because they threw you one surprise party one time? Well, we might go back to the claim here and notice that he's not saying stop trusting people entirely as soon as you notice one error. But it says you can't give complete trust to things that are at least once deceptive, right? So all he's saying is that you can't give 100% credence to information from something that we know sometimes, at least sometimes, produces error. Right? Now, one of the big sources of error Descartes notices, and a big source of people's beliefs, is their senses. Right? You form a lot of your beliefs, like whether it's sunny or rainy, whether you're feeling sick or healthy, whether the milk is good or bad, based on your senses. Right? This is how most people navigate the world, and if you ask people, how do you come to know things? A lot of people are going to say, your senses. But notice what Descartes' doing here. He's saying, look, you have to start with something completely reliable. You can't trust something that's deceived you even once. And we should notice that our senses do deceive us sometimes. So, for instance, if you're driving down a long, flat highway on a hot day, and you look far out, it looks like there's water on the road, right? But as you drive up to it, it sort of vanishes and you realize that's a mirage. Or if you stick a pencil into a glass of water, well, the pencil will look bent even though it isn't, right? So your senses can deceive you. And Descartes starts to wonder if this point about the deceptiveness of the senses can be maybe like a starting move in his methodological skepticism. And this does sort of fit into a discussion that the meditator has about different levels of doubt. So, I call this like the 3 levels of doubt, as some readers of Descartes do. The first thing that he flags is doubt about the senses. Things sometimes aren't as they seem. Now, you might start to ask yourself, how big of a worry should this be? And Descartes himself notices that, yeah, like the senses are not completely trustworthy, but he's also willing to admit we can find ways to use our senses responsibly, and this problem in and of itself is not a big deal. Because oftentimes we can look closer at things, right? So, for instance, you might think that a tower that you're looking at from far away is square, but then you come right up to it and you see it has no corners, it's completely round, right? And that's from correcting senses with more senses. And you might also realize that, well, yeah, your senses deceive you sometimes, but that doesn't ruin all kinds of knowledge. So, for instance, you don't need to use your senses to check my proof that I just offered, that there's an infinite number of prime numbers, right? So that's not a sense-based thing. You don't have to do any scientific experiments to know that 2 plus 3 equals 5, right? So some knowledge doesn't depend on the material world. And sense misperception is not like, Descartes calls these the beliefs of insane people, and he says like a person who thinks that their head is a pumpkin or made out of earthenware, or he says even somebody who thinks that they are made entirely of glass, right? So he says that doubt about the senses can go pretty far, but it doesn't take away all knowledge, right? And it doesn't seem like as big of a deal. Remember, it's sort of like the meditations are almost like the meditator having a conversation with themselves. But he says, but, you know, we call people crazy for believing that they are made of glass. But he says, as a person who sleeps, sometimes I will believe things that are just as crazy, right? I will think that I'm flying up in the air when in fact I'm just in bed sleeping, right? And the big problem with this is that in a situation when you are dreaming, you don't realize that you're not dreaming, right? So the thought would be, just because something seems certain and obvious to you in the moment isn't in fact evidence that you know something. Now, I'll leave this for you to reflect on, whether you can know for certain that you are not dreaming. What could you say about this moment right now to tell yourself that this is not a dream? I genuinely believe in this moment that I'm not dreaming, and I might say, well, it's because my day has been a long, coherent story, and it's not wild and crazy and strange, like the experiences that I label as dreams afterwards. But Descartes is still going to say, but wait a second, that's exactly what you would say if you were dreaming, right? So there is a puzzle here. But Descartes will at least admit that your dreams are still about something, right? So just like a Pegasus is a mixture of, I don't know, horses and wings and magic, well, that means that horses and wings and magic have to come from somewhere. We have to have gotten that concept from somewhere. So we say, we can at least know that something has to be real. So dreams maybe don't ruin all possible knowledge. Descartes says, but wait, what if I am the product of some all-powerful being? Now, most people like Descartes would think, yeah, they're the product of an all-powerful being, i.e. God, right? But what if you are the product of an all-powerful being who's not all good, but who is completely bad? This would be what Descartes would call evil demon doubt, right? So this is an all-powerful being that creates all your beliefs. So even though there isn't a real world outside your mind, the evil demon is making it seem like there is one. Maybe kind of like the Matrix. Right? And Not only that, but the evil demon can fool you about things that seem certain. So, not just whether there is a world outside your mind, whether horses or birds are real, but the evil demon can also mess with your ability to reason. So, here's what the demon could do here. Imagine every time you do a mathematical proof, the demon makes you screw up, and then right after the demon makes you screw up, the demon makes you think you did a great job, right? So it's like you're sitting there going 2 plus 3 equals 7. Obviously. And you just keep doing this. You keep on making mistakes, but you keep on being oblivious to your own mistakes, right? So the evil demon could do that. And now Descartes is going to say, not only is your sense perception on a case-by-case basis in doubt, not only should we be worried about our dreams, but we should be worried about whether anything exists and about our own ability to reason. And that's where meditation 1 leaves us. Right? So the way that Descartes, the meditator, is thinking at the end of meditation 1 is that until we can rule out this worst case scenario, we should withhold our belief in everything. So in other words, if you should withhold your belief, you would say you're not really reasonable to believe that yet. So in other words, we can say, you don't know anything. You don't have the right to make any knowledge claims until you can answer the evil demon challenge. So that's the puzzle that Descartes leaves us with at the end of meditation 1. We come up with the worst case scenario in terms of doubt, and we realize that maybe certainty is something that we can't have. But remember, the meditations come in steps. And as such, we will have to wait until meditation 2 to see whether we can actually know anything. So thanks for listening in, and we'll pick things up from there.